3 minutes on the clock, a Sicilian on the board, and an opponent rated within a single point of me. David Lai, 810 to my 809. This is one of those blitz games where nothing spectacular happens for a long time. And then, in the space of one capture, the whole evaluation tips over. I want to show you this game not because I played a masterpiece. I didn't. I made several imprecise moves along the way, and I'll point every one of them out. I want to show you this game because it demonstrates something more useful than brilliance. What it looks like to build a small edge patiently, and then never let go of it. I open with pawn to e4, and my opponent answers pawn to c5, the Sicilian. But after knight to f3 and pawn to e6, the game takes a very specific turn. I push pawn to d4, and instead of the usual capture, my opponent strikes back in the center with pawn to d5. This is the Marshall Counterattack, a rare, sharp line of the Sicilian, and the position simplifies almost immediately. I take on d5, my opponent recaptures with the pawn, and the tension in the center is gone. What's left is a symmetrical-looking structure with one small asymmetry. My opponent has an isolated pawn sitting on d5, and I have a comfortable, open board to work with. The position gives me a slight edge for me. Nothing dramatic, but a direction. Bishop to b5 check gives check, and my opponent blocks with the bishop on d7. I take it, my opponent recaptures with the queen, a clean bishop trade, one bishop leaving from each side. Then I castle, and we both simply develop. Bishop to e7, knight to c3, knight to f6, bishop to g5, and my opponent castles too. I bring the rook to e1 onto the open file, pointing straight at the center. Nothing loud has happened here. No tactics, no fireworks. Just 12 moves of sensible development, and through all of it, the evaluation stays exactly where it was, a slight edge for me. That's worth sitting with for a moment. At this level, most games are decided by one big mistake, but the ones that feel effortless usually start like this. Nothing forced, nothing risky, just pieces on good squares, waiting. And then my opponent starts to drift. The bishop retreats from e7 all the way back to d8, a move that undevelops a piece and does very little. The evaluation notices. It moves from a slight edge for me to a clear advantage for me. I don't waste the invitation. Knight to e5 plants the knight in the heart of the position. My opponent's queen swings out to f5, and I take on f6 with the bishop, capturing a knight. My opponent recaptures with the bishop, a piece each, but notice what's happened to the board. It's opening up, and it's opening up in my favor. Then knight takes d5. I collect that isolated pawn. A clear advantage for me, and now with an extra pawn to go with it. And this is where everything changes. My opponent plays bishop takes e5, capturing my knight. On the surface, it looks like the natural move. A piece is hanging, so you take it. But this is the single biggest swing of the entire game, and it goes in my direction. The evaluation leaps from a clear advantage for me to winning for me. My opponent has just handed the game away, not with a wild blunder, but with a capture that felt automatic. That's the lesson hiding in this moment. The most dangerous moves in blitz are the ones you don't think about. The obvious recapture, the natural-looking take. Before you play it, ask yourself one question. What does the position look like after the dust settles? I recapture with the rook. Rook takes c5, taking the bishop. And I have to be honest with you here. This was not the best way to collect. The evaluation drops noticeably on this move. There was something sharper available, and I didn't find it. But here's the important part, and it's a distinction that beginners often miss. A move can be a mistake and still leave you completely fine. After rook takes e5, the position is still winning for me. I gave back some of what my opponent handed me, but not the game. Not every inaccuracy is a catastrophe. What matters is whether you're still standing on the right side of the position afterwards. I was. My opponent's queen returns to d7. I check with knight to e7. Check. The king steps to h8, and I bring the queen out to h5. everything now aimed at a king that has very little air around it. My opponent plays rook to e8, and at that instant, a forced win appears on the board. Mate in 2. It was there. I didn't see it. Instead, I played queen takes f7, taking a pawn. A good practical move, a strong move in any other game, but it let the forced mate slip away. The position remains winning for me, and in blitz, with under a minute of thinking time in reserve, that is a trade most of us would make without knowing we made it. Still, this is exactly the kind of position worth training. When your opponent's king is boxed into the corner and your queen and knight are both looking at it, slow down. Count the checks. The mate may already be sitting there. My opponent develops the knight to c6. I check with knight to g6, check, and my opponent takes the knight with the h-pawn. Pawn takes g6. But that opens the door for the move I want. Queen takes d7, capturing my opponent's queen. The queens are not both gone. Mine is still very much alive, and my opponent is now playing without one. The knight takes my rook on e5. I recapture with the d-pawn, and my opponent doubles up with rook to d8. Then I check on h3, the king steps back to g8, and I bring the rook to e1. The material picture is stark now. I have a queen, a rook, and 7 pawns against 2 rooks and 5 pawns. Winning for me, and with a passed pawn beginning to look very interesting on e5. Now comes the messy stretch, and I'm not going to dress it up. My opponent's rook drops to d2, deep in my position. I push the pawn to e6, one step from promotion. The rook grabs on c2, and I push again, pawn to e7. That push was inaccurate. The evaluation fell back sharply. Then my opponent takes on b2, and it swings hard the other way. Then I play pawn to a4, and it falls back again. Back and forth, both of us slipping, both of us at the edge of our clocks. And through every one of those wobbles, one thing never changes. The position stays winning for me. My opponent pushes pawn to c4, and a forced win appears on the board again. Queen to e6 check gives check. The king goes to h8, and I take the pawn on c4. Winning for me, still, but each time I choose the material over the mate. This is what real blitz looks like. Not clean, not precise, but a winning position is remarkably forgiving if you never actually give it away. My opponent's rook takes on e7. My passed pawn is gone, and once again, a forced win is on the board for me. I choose checks instead. Queen to c8, check. The king to h7. Queen to h3, check, with another check. The king back to g8. Then, queen to c3. My opponent's rook takes on e1, capturing my rook and giving check. And I take that rook back with the queen. A clean rook trade, one leaving from each side. What's left is a pure queen against rook endgame. My queen, my opponent's lone rook, and a handful of pawns. Winning for me, and now with nothing left on the board to complicate it. My opponent's rook swings to a2, going after my last queenside pawn. I push it forward, pawn to a5, and my opponent simply takes it. Rook takes a5, and that's the end. Queen takes a5 captures the rook, and my opponent is left with a king and 4 pawns against my queen and 3. There is no checkmate here. My opponent resigned, and they were right to. The board after qxa5 offers nothing at all. It's a quiet finish to a game that never had a truly loud moment. The position had been winning for me since move 13, and despite every wobble along the way, it stayed winning for me right to the last move. So what do you take away from this one? 3 things. First, the game turned on a capture that looked completely automatic. bxc5 wasn't a wild idea. It was the natural move, played quickly, and it flipped the evaluation from a clear advantage for me to winning for me. In blitz, the moves that cost you games are rarely the ones you agonize over. They're the ones you don't examine at all. Second, I made mistakes here. The recapture on e5 was imprecise. I missed a forced mate. I pushed my pawn at the wrong moment. And none of it cost me the game, because a winning position is durable if you keep making reasonable moves. Perfection is not the requirement. Persistence is. And third, notice how the advantage was built, not with a combination, but with an open file, an isolated pawn to attack, and pieces on active squares. The tactics didn't create the advantage, they collected it. If you enjoyed this one, a real game, honestly analyzed, mistakes and all, consider subscribing. That's what this channel is. Not highlight reels, but complete games, with the awkward moments left in, because that's where the learning actually lives. Tell me in the comments, would you have found the mate on move 16? Be honest. I didn't. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next game.